So we are going to be looking at war, the arms trade, and child soldiers this week. I know that was what you were supposed to be doing in session 5, but when I originally joined over, there was a little bit of a crossover. So we're going to be looking at that this week. So just a recap of what you have missed, basically. All right, I'll try and keep it as short and as sweet as possible for you as well. All right, I mean, the slides are really self-explanatory to begin with, but I'll just touch on each one as quickly as I can. Obviously, we're not going to be looking at the YouTube clips and stuff because the video itself won't actually allow us to play them whilst I'm talking to you, because it's not like Skype, it's totally different. So I'll just try and get through them as best as I can. All right. So what we're going to look at is, what is the definition of war? How has it changed over time? Um, is it more government led, or was it, historically kingdom led? We'll look at that. Look at the arms trade as well, and touch on specifically who's been victimised by war. So we're going to be looking at women and girls, and what the aftermath was of war, and what happened during war. How were things like rape and murder used as a product of warfare in terms of like winning the wars and things like that. So we'll go through it all step by step, but I will try and keep it as short and sweet as possible. All right, and please excuse the fact that this is my first YouTube video, so please be nice. So first things first, if you go to slide 3, what is war? So definition here by Shaw, and he states that it is basically two different organised armed forces specifically seeking to destroy each other's power. And also the other people are trying to resist by killing the key members. So historically, if you think about the different wars that happened when everything was ruled by kingdoms rather than by governments, they would specifically try and kill, the top members of the royal family, whereas now quite a lot of it's to do with, people who are quite high up in government and things like that. And it's also been argued that it's actually not specifically a part of the human condition. It's not something that, is kind of inherently within us, whereas sociobiologists, which we will get onto, would argue that actually it is. But no, so what Giddens has actually said, Giddens took this from what Clausewitz said that wars are specifically calculated based on if they're going to win or if they're going to lose. So what the probability of success is going to be for the side that's actually trying to fight. So if they don't really think that the chances are very good, they're probably not going to start off a war. If they actually think, yeah, we're going to win, we've got quite a lot of ammunition here, we've got quite a lot of armies, quite a lot of soldiers, then yeah, we'll probably win this war. Then yeah, fair enough, we'll go for it. So it's very calculated in the way in which wars are structured and built up. Okay, so it's not just something that, oh, we're going to go and fight these people over here. It's very, very structured, very organised, very calculated, and that's really important. Now, the nature of war itself has changed massively in terms of how modernity has made war incredibly politicised, which I'll talk about on the next slide. So yeah, wars now have become incredibly politicised in terms of why we have wars in the first place. So it might not be just for, to try and rule someone else's territory, but it might now be to completely destroy someone else's territory. It might be to force an ideology upon other groups of people. So say ISIS as an example, they might actually try and force their ideology onto other people. And they might have this idea, or they do have this idea, should I really say, that if a man dies by blowing himself up, killing lots of people in the process, he will then go to paradise and be at peace with Allah. Whereas that is a very twisted version of what Islam really is. It's a very peaceful religion and doesn't really advocate violence. Whereas organised violence, by what what ISIS do, is very, very different. So yeah, that's what war is basically. Two groups of people fighting against each other. It's a very, very social phenomena. It's something that has developed and changed over time, and we'll look at specifically how. If you look at the next slide here as well, there's a couple of different pictures of what war may actually look like to certain people. So nowadays, it's become incredibly commercialised. So if you look at games like Call of Duty, and you look at War and Terror, and things like that, it has become incredibly commercialized and people buy into it. And it's also very gendered as well. So these games are statistically aimed at boys and men rather than women, because historically men were the ones who went into battle in comparison with women. Women had some sort of inherent urge to actually stay at home and look after the children and make sure that they were safe, and they then became the matriarch of that family while the man was off fighting the war. So that's how it historically used to play part of. And you might even remember the posters of in America, where there was the different posters where it said, your country needs you, and there was a lot of posters of women as well, holding their arms up, which is might remember. So again, it's all commercializing war, making it more attractive for people to try and join up. So people do it that way, such as the US and the UK historically, whereas people like ISIS, ISIL, Al Qaeda, they do this through ideology. So at the end of the day, it's all propaganda. It's just how it gets presented to the group of people that they're trying to target that it actually changes. Okay, so I'll touch a little bit on the history now. Okay, now if you look at the history of war, we question why. So if you go to slide 5, it says here that there was a quantitative study done by Wimmer and Min, and they looked how war was one of the biggest generators of social change and how it has proceeded to change the way in which society acts, the way in which war is viewed, how it's more of a negative thing now than what a positive thing was, rather than showing strength and dominance. War is trying, we need to avoid this as much as possible. And this is how we now have nation states. So historically, you had kingdoms and tribal confederacies and empires, like the Ottoman Empire, and obviously you've got the empires which are in Egypt, and you had different kingdoms as well, like in the United Kingdom. And if you look at the film Mary Queen of Scots, there's that kind of kingdom as well. So it is very different, and it's changed massively now because wars are not specifically executed and started off by heads of royal families. It's always by governments, and each government has their own army of people, their own weapons, and we'll go on later to talk about how the different kinds of people who would be in armies has changed drastically as well. Okay, so yeah, point number 3 on slide 5. So this has given birth to modernity, eventually brought about the democratic, liberal, tolerant, and economically prosperous welfare states. So again, war has produced the welfare state. War has produced the economy. It's produced the fact that we live within a very democratic, liberal society that we're in today. So as I say, war's changed massively, and it's not just changed in terms of the way people look at war. It's turned the way in which society physically operates as well. And if it wasn't for war and a massive historical legacy of very structured, very organized forms of violence, we wouldn't have modernity as it was today. If you go to slide 6, we talk about civilization through modernity as well. Okay, so in terms of that, during the 10th and the 11th centuries, only 60,000 individuals actually died in war, which is a really low number if you think about what it's like now in comparison. So the casualties rose massively in the 12th and 13th to 539,000. So just short of over 500,000 people died. But these are more like frontline people, whereas the numbers are still including civilians as well, which again I'll go on to talk about later on. Now the last 200 years, that surpassed all the previous history with an escalation in the number of war dead. Over 19 million in the 19th century and more than 111 million in the 20th century just by itself. So as the years are going on, the number of casualties are massively increasing. And that's not just because people on the front line are dying, it's because civilians are dealing with the backlash of this as well, from things like bombs being dropped, World War I, World War II. And when the bombs were dropped from Germany on massive cities, massive amounts of people died, which is why they sent the children off to live in the country so then they wouldn't get bombed, because they weren't a major target there. And they needed this next generation of capitalist workers to live on and then reproduce the next set. So there's a lot of Marxist ideology within that as well, which we can touch on. But if you look at the first and second lectures of the theories of human rights abuses, you'll be able to draw upon the human rights abuses theory and apply it to things like war, child soldiers, the arms trade, etc. Now, the fourth point on this slide, on slide 6, says, in contrast to popular perception, war and organised violence do not disappear or fade away, but dramatically escalate in the modern age. It's more organised and it's more structured because it wasn't just random people fighting to sign up. Now, you're either part of the army or the navy, or you're a mercenary. You might be part of MI5, MI6, more privatised organisations as well. So there's different forms of war, whether that be your average James Bond, or whether this be somebody who's a Navy SEAL. So as I say, it's very, very different in terms of the role that you play, but ultimately it ends in the same goal. And there's different theories surrounding war, okay? There's sociobiologist explanations, there's essentialist explanations, and we will obviously go through them as well in the next few slides. So you'll have to excuse the fact that I'm trying to go through the slides on my laptop as I'm still talking to you guys as well. Okay then, so how has war changed? There's different kinds of war and the different goals, the types of armies, etc., etc. So if you have a look at the table that you've got in front of you now on slide 7, you've got the goals of war, the types of war, the military technique, and the war economy. How has it changed? So in the 17th and the 18th centuries, you had mercenaries and professionals who would go out and be that kind of army. Whereas if you look at now, you've got very scientific military elite and professional armies. So very, very well trained members of the army. You've got you've got these snipers, and you've got these people who develop all these different kinds of nuclear bombs and different kinds of spy technology, etc. Surveillance. So as I say, surveillance wasn't really a thing in the 17th century when it was more kingdom based. It's drastically changed. So the way in technology's changed has made war also become a lot more advanced and a lot more difficult to detect as well, because a lot of it is done now behind closed doors. Not as much of it is as open as what it used to be as well. And even in the early 20th century, they had physically mass armies, and they had like tanks and aircraft and firepower. And to be honest, a lot of the money which goes into war is still spent on things like helicopters, tanks, submarines, that kind of thing, like the physical elements of what make up a war, which people need in order to commit the acts of violence. Okay, so we'll go on to slide 8. And slide 8 talks about the new war thesis. Okay, so the ways of waging war, they're not fixed. They're very, very fluid. They change drastically over time. Um, and they don't just change drastically over time because the fact that politics is now the main dominance in terms of how a country's run, but the fact that there's been social change, economic change, political change as well. So a lot more women now fight in armies and things like that in comparison with previously. If you look at the binary opposites I always talk about in class, you've got your man, he's strong, he's very dominant, very exertive. A woman, just very, submissive and quiet and calm and stays in the house, doesn't have any acts of violence. Whereas now, women can be just as violent as men. We know that every single day because women are abused and men are abused, and it's by each other, same sex and opposite sex. So that's something that I think we should, we really need to look at. And the industrialised total wars of the early 20th century, i.e., World War One and Two, were very different to smaller wars because a lot of civilians were involved in these. Many people were killed, as I mentioned earlier. Bombs were dropped on houses, etc. And also people just walking up and down in the street. If civilians were seen by the armies from the opposite side, they would be shot. If you look at things like the Holocaust, a lot of Jewish people were killed, and they were just civilians. So again, they weren't the people who were attacking Germany. They were just a byproduct, unfortunately, of what Germany wanted to do. They wanted to just kill every single Jewish person. Not every single German man wanted to do that, but that was Hitler's ideology that he reinforced and used this war in order to get to these people. So as we've mentioned, ideology changes as well. Now, in Africa and Eastern Europe in the late 20th century, a new kind of war began to emerge, and this was a low intensity conflict. So this was very militia, very guerrilla style. It's more localized than nationalized. A lot of people tend to call these terrorist groups. So again, things like, as I've already mentioned, ISIS, ISIL, Al Qaeda. And they use that kind of conflict and violence, which is seen in civil war. But these new wars have very transnational connections. So it's not necessarily just within one country or one continent. They look at this all across the world as well. And globalization has had a massive, massive impact in terms of how these wars have had such a global presence and dominance. So you've got things like international reporters, mercenary troops, military advisors. You've got charities as well, which get involved too, such as Oxfam, British Red Cross, WaterAid, Oxfam, I already mentioned Oxfam, UNICEF. So all these different kinds of people are also involved, and these are called what we would see as social actors. So these are people who are taking a part of what this war is, but they're not actually the ones who are firing the guns. These are the people who are supporting the civilians, trying to get them to stop, get them away from the situation and try and help them out as best as they can. So if we go to the next slide along, slide 9, if my PC will allow me to do that. So it says in the bottom, robotic arms, no conscience. Russia already has these. So a man can make a decision. Am I going to shoot the gun? Am I not? There's that consciousness behind that. Whereas with a lot of AI technology and a lot of robotic stuff, it's either shoot or not shoot. Someone's pressing the button, but a lot of things that like the robotic stuff that I mentioned, Russia already has this technology in place. So therefore, you'll have to excuse me sore throat, by the way. Hope none of you have coronavirus, by the way, and you're all staying safe. But yeah, as I mentioned, a lot of the stuff with Russia, they've already got quite mass technology as well, nuclear weapons, things like that. So these are the kind of things that actually are we going to be having a war in the future where it doesn't consist of, an army of 3 million people. It could be one nuclear weapon that could just end up blowing a massive area to shreds. I mean, look at what happened in Hiroshima. Do you know what I mean? So many civilians died. Countless amounts of people died because of one bomb. So as I say, this is kind of the way in which war is developing going forward. It's down to one piece of equipment which has the biggest amount of mass destruction that you can think of. So on to slide 10, we'll have a look at some pretty classical theorists which are very, very key within the sociology area. So we will have a look at a bit of Weber for a start. Now, he argued that the modern state is defined by its ability to monopolise the use of force over a particular territory. And its historical development was tied to victories over the battlefield. So cultural prestige and power prestige were closely associated. However, every victorious war enhances the state's cultural prestige. So the more wars which are won, the more cultural prestige you have. So again, it was very push and pull. It was all about, finding the power structure within that. And Marx, Karl Marx, major Marxist theorist, well, he invented Marxism, let's be honest. He talks about how revolutionary violence and proletarian-led warfare were seen as a catalyst of social change. So if you look at the French Revolution, for example, you had the bourgeoisie, you had the proletariat, two very different social classes, very, very similar to the Tutsis and the Hutus when we looked at the Rwandan genocide the first week I came in. So again, two very different social classes. And this was causing a massive uprise, which was, again, pushing for revolutionary change, trying to completely dissimulate the class structure. And in terms of what Durkheim said, Durkheim, again, founding father of functionalism, Emile Durkheim, for those who don't already know, he said that war was a product of anomie, so complete disarray. And this represented a very organised attempt to change from a very organic form of solidarity to a very mechanical one. So trying to take full control over everything and making sure that it wasn't just happening organically. So in the UK, you've got the heart, which is the government, and you've got the NHS, the school systems, that kind of thing. So that's what you would class as your organic analogy. Whereas you've got mechanical solidarity as well. And this is more structured, it's more put into place, it's more calculated, it's more thought through. And Durkheim actually wanted to test the idea that suicide and warfare were actually intrinsically linked. And he actually provided quite a lot of evidence to say that the outbreak of war massively reduced the amount of suicide rates, should I really say, because people felt that there was more of a togetherness, there was a solidarity, so therefore they felt as though they were a part of something, that they had a purpose. So if they fought in a war, they had a purpose, they had something to fight for, then therefore the amount of suicide decreased. So there is a nice causal link there that you can look at. So if we go to slide 11, Simmel and Sorrell made an attempt to explain the direct impact of war as an experience on people's social behaviours. So they also carry on to say that war is an exceptional social state that radically and instantly transforms social dynamics. So again, this completely reaffirms what I say every single week about binary opposites and how gender has a mass influence on this. So the way in which men internalise the idea that they need to go out and be the protector, the breadwinner, the provider, they need to look after their family, and the way that the women need to, do the dishes and feed the children and clean up after them and raise them and be, rushing to a man whenever, he needs her. It's a very heteronormative idea, and war is very heteronormative. I really need to mention that because historically women would never fight in a war. So this is a very heteronormative ideal, which is what Putin at the moment is currently instilling within Russia. Very heteronormative, very masculine ideology. So if you do ever want to read anything on masculinity as well, I'd probably recommend reading R.W. Connell on the book Masculinities. That's a really good textbook that you can use as well. and it's available in the library, or if you go in the library catalogue, there's quite a lot of stuff on that as well. Since you no longer have access to the library, it is available on the catalogue. So just have a look. If you can't find it on there, try Google Books. Okay, so for Simmel specifically, they said that war itself is a unique social event, and he actually used the term an absolute situation. So it transcends all normal experience by really heightening human feelings and social meanings. So it revitalized the moral fiber of the entire society, as he very specifically said. Whereas Sorrell, on the other hand, said that the human sacrifices that resulted from the conflict generate special feelings of class solidarity. So while Sorrell talks about the united front that we always have in terms of the solidarity between the classes, Sommel puts the argument forward that actually it makes every single person, regardless of class, re-question the morality of what's going on. So a bit like what's happening with coronavirus at the minute. Obviously, every single person is questioning, we need to do this together, we need to be in this together, let's not go out, stay indoors, only go to the shops as and when you need. Don't be, everyone go for a massive party down the beach. Like, we kind of need to stick together. And again, it links directly back to what Sorrell's saying as well. So everyone's questioning their morality and questioning whether it's right or whether it's wrong. And this is how wars have changed over time, as I've said. So when I mentioned earlier there was a sociobiologist explanation, this again, it links directly back to what I was saying about the gender roles. So they talk about how there is an interconnected competition over resources and reproduction, which is the root cause of conflict and fighting within humans as all other animal species. So this is my turf, get off, it's mine, I want it. This is how a lot of colonisation happened as well. So in Rwanda, when Belgium came in, they decided it was theirs and they did what they want with it. So again, it's all about the way in which countries try and take something for themselves. When the UK made India a part of the British Empire, I should say when Great Britain made India a part of the British Empire, again, trying to put that forward. And what is actually quite sad to see is that even though historically we've changed our morality, the UK, and we've changed our views on war, and it's a lot more, we try and stay away from violence as much as possible because it's a really negative thing. We don't want to, go around murdering people. I know some people just don't like the human race, Craig. Um, so yeah, as I say, it's one of those things, isn't it, where a lot of the ideas that we had historically, i.e., we want to commit acts of violence and show our authority and, we own you. A lot of these countries, even though they've then became independent countries still, they still actually uphold a lot of the values that we instilled back then. So even though they never had those values before we originally colonized them. So again, it's about internalizing these ideas and keeping them, even though we've changed ours. They've still kept the original ideas that the UK had back then, or what Belgium had back then, or other countries which used to colonize as well. And Wilson, he argued that violence, organised violence in all of its forms, is well, specifically belligerent behaviour. It's rooted in the aggressive impulses, which are firm genetic foundation, which has evolved over millions of years. So their argument putting forward, Wilson's, is basically saying if you're a man, you have this part of your body, your DNA makeup, which makes you want to be aggressive and assertive and kill things. But as women, you don't want to do that. You want to, sit back and have a cup of tea and relax. And, you don't want to be part of the army because it's not in your DNA makeup. So they do actually put a lot of essentialist ideas forward because they think that war is inherent in our DNA. Now, as a social constructionist myself, I think it's bollocks, to be totally honest. There's nothing in your DNA that makes you want to be aggressive. There's nothing in your DNA that makes you want to be violent. Yes, men have testosterone levels, whereas women have estrogen. Yes, there is hormonal differences within our bodies. That's completely fair. It's been scientifically proven. However, there's nothing in your DNA makeup that makes you want to commit a very specific act. So I think it's really important that we internalise that idea. He did put the argument forward about the high levels of testosterone makes men inherently more aggressive and war prone, whereas the estrogen with the women make them intimately more sociable and huddle together, and make them less physically venturesome. They don't want to leave the nest, they want to stay there. So again, it's all these different gender codes and gender regimes, which Connell talks a lot about, which kind of backs up the argument of what Wilson is saying. I do apologise, by the way, for the camera quality. This is not my usual laptop. I'm having to borrow a family member's for the moment, so I am sorry. So, he carries on saying that aggression, you're impulsive, you're effective, you've got an immediate response, you're very spontaneous. So, again, we do kind of, get rid of that argument. And this is a massive critique of it, because it says that this is what aggression implies. We know that you're not inherently aggressive. We know that you're not inherently strong, because men are not physically stronger than women as part of their DNA makeup. But a lot of women can be stronger than men. It just depends on how that person exercises, what their body mass is, all that kind of thing. So it's very, very different. Another critique of what the sociobiologists are saying is that war is planned, it's very organised, there's intent, mass division of labour, a very gendered division of labour as well, by the way, a very coordinated collective form of conscious action. So again, the planning, the thought, it's very methodical, the way in which it's planned out. So again, it's not in our DNA, it's not something where people just go around shooting people in the face, do you know what I mean? There is an actual process behind it, a very thought out social process. And it's a massive social phenomenon. As I've said, it's not something that we inherently take on board and just go out and do it. Historically, a lot of people who used to fight in these wars might have done that because of the way that they felt about themselves, about their aggression, about their assertiveness, about their wanting to be violent and protect their families, which again is fair enough. But we can see now that the need for that is not as much, due to the fact that more technologies are now in place, and the nuclear weapons which are there are there because they don't need mass armies like what they used to, and they're trying to do that as well by minimising as many casualties as possible. So slide 14, hope you're all still with me. If you do need to kind of rewind the video at any point, just please feel free to do so as and when. So development trends. So one of the main trends of war is the violence against women and children. They've always been victims. When we looked at the minority populations last week, sorry, not last week, the week before, when I actually was teaching in class with you face to face, one of the things that was looked at was the fact that women and children are the people who are mainly refugees in new countries. They are the people who are less educated, and they don't have access to this because, again, a lot of male privilege, patriarchy, that kind of thing. And it says here that the declining control that states now exert over their borders, escalation of regional conflicts and civil wars in the aftermath of the Cold War, declining capacity of states to control the armed conflict, and the changing nature of warfare itself. So certain types of weaponry, such as landmines, rocket-propelled grenades and small arms, are much more easily dispersed and bought globally as well. And going back to the women and children stuff, yes, women and children have been the most victimised from forms of war in terms of civilian casualties. But I don't just mean this by, women getting blown up because their house was a target. Men used to rape women as a form of trying to subordinate the opposition, to say, we have your woman, we've just raped her, we've committed acts of sexual and physical violence towards her, we own you now, you can't do anything about that. So that was a tactic that they used in order to try and subordinate the other side of the opposition as well. So if you go to slide 15, is it gendered? Massively, yes. War is 100% gendered. And Kelly in 2000, if you go to the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the sixth point down on slide 15, Kelly makes a really good point and backs up what I've just said. Women's bodies are constructed as territory to be conquered. So again, it wasn't just the country that they tried to take over. If they took over their women, then they took over the country as a consequence of that. So again, it's one thing leading to another to another. And a lot of the stuff, because war is so gendered, it's totally altered the rules governing warfare globally. So they used to try and minimise as much harm as possible to non-combatants, i.e. civilians, so women and children. But they now make up to 70 to 80% of the world's refugees. Kelly also makes that point as well. And again, as I've mentioned, the sexual violence against women has been developed by some nation states or armed forces as a deliberate tactic of the war. And patriarchal cultures, hegemonic masculinity, all these different things, when you look at gender, has a huge influence on this. And it wasn't just they do this to say, we own your woman now, we've raped her, we've committed acts of physical, sexual violence, whatever that might be. They did it to humiliate the men who were fighting these wars, because it made them feel a lot more emasculated and knocked their sense of self and what their ideologies were. And going back to Simmel and Sorrell's work about the feeling of a collective conscience, by dominating the women, that feeling of collective consciousness was totally broken down. So that's an argument you could put forward if you were wanting to critique the work of, Marx and Durkheim, etc. And they would destroy all the enemy's culture and they would replace it with that of what the victor was. So whoever won their thoughts, their feelings, their norms, values, cultural expectations, they then became the dominant ones. So if we go to slide 16 now, there's a video clip that I would like you to watch in your own time. It's called The Greatest Silence, Rape in the Congo. I'm just going to put a quick trigger warning out there. It is really difficult to watch about what happened in the DRC. So again, just a bit of a trigger warning for you. If you feel uncomfortable at any point, you know, as I say every week, just don't watch it, but you can read about it later on as well if you do want to. So we're going to look at how the what the economic explanations are for war as well. So how globalization generated new wars, many of which emerge as the direct means of economic policy. So global neoliberal policies give a lot of privilege to multinational corporations, i.e., okay, so you supply us, a foreign country, who actually want to use our weapons against you. A lot of this happens in the US. The US is one of the biggest exporters of the different kinds of things like guns and tanks and nuclear weapons and that kind of stuff. So they do send a lot of it out, and they do make a massive profit off the back of it. So the fact that capitalism works, even if it's not for the person who's going to benefit from it in the end, as long as they make money off the back of that, that's their ultimate goal, really. And wars are fought over not just the people or the ideology, but over properties such as oil, solid minerals, that kind of thing. And they're placed in a position to profit very, very quickly on the remains of these collapsing failed states. So Somalia, I can't even speak today, Democratic Republic of Congo, Bosnia, other places as well. So we'll move on now to slide 18. So arms trade. So we've looked at war, we'll look a little more on the arms trade now. So in 2014 alone, over $1,000 billion was spent annually just on the military. And this was to purchase things like helicopters, submarines, aircraft, boats, artillery, tanks, that kind of thing. Now, if you take a look at the Grimmett report in 2012, okay, this actually specifically looks at the different developing countries, and these are the main focus of the arms sales. These are the people who want all of the weapons I've just mentioned above. The Middle East is America's biggest market, especially Saudi Arabia. So if you do ever want to look at human rights reports at Saudi Arabia, have a look at the Human Rights Watch website, which I know I've mentioned, and a few emails to different people as well, if you do want to look at that. So criticisms of the arms trade as well. So in order to make up for a lack of sales from domestic and traditional markets for the military equipment, newer markets are being created or sought after, and human rights is massively overlooked. Okay, and arms are sold to very well-known human rights violators, which is why Saudi Arabia is one of the biggest groups of people, that takes in a lot of the weapons. They've got a lot of human rights abuses, which you can find on that website. So number 19, quick bar chart. 33% of the exports are from the US, Russia is 25%, China's 5.9%. But what I think is very interesting, if you look over to the right-hand side where the imports are, China also takes 4.7% of imports, so that is probably one of the only countries which has a lot of export and import of the same kind of weapons. And it shows you all the different landmines causing civilian casualties on slide 20. Clip on slide 21. Again, I want to try and get through this as quickly as I possibly can for you. Please do have a look at the YouTube link for the campaign against the arms trade, because it is definitely worth a watch. Now, if you look at the global arms sales from 2004 to 2011, and you look at the developing countries and compare to the very industrialised ones, such as the US and the UK, and a lot of European countries, they tend to stay quite flat in terms of the industrialised nations. And the developing nations tend to have very much higher arms sales. And you can contrast that to slide 19 as well, if you want to. So yeah, in summary, the theories of war have shown how globalisation has had a massive impact on the oil and the private different sectors. War is incredibly gendered, and the development of gendered warfare and different weapons as well has come into play as modernity is pushed on. It's no longer a simple trench warfare. A lot of other globalised actors and organisations and nations have been very invested within wars and conflict, and human rights violations stem from vested interest in conflict as well. So we've gone through all of that. You can see the session aims and objectives there. If you do need any other questions, queries around this specific topic, if you just want to ask us any more questions, please do feel free to do so. I know not a lot of child soldier stuff was touched on there at all. My apologies. But if you do want to look at some good films about the child soldiers, take a look on Netflix of Beasts of No Nation, which is brilliant, and the film Blood Diamond. You can look quite a lot at the use of human trafficking within that and how men were sent to different parts of Africa who were already from Africa. So again, origin and destination couldn't be being the same, a bit like what we touched on a few weeks ago. You can actually look at that and it will specifically tell you about how the men were abused by the child soldiers because they were that high on heroin and they were drugged up and literally taken away from their families, kidnapped, abducted, and they would learn how to shoot and they were drugged up, and then different ideologies were placed into the minds of these very small children. They were brainwashed. And this is another major human rights abuse as well. So if you do want to look at that, by all means, please do so. All I can say is thank you for listening, and I hope you guys thoroughly enjoy the rest of your weekend and the rest of your days as well. You know, if you need to get in contact with me, it's just megan.nicholson@sunderland.ac.uk. So thanks for listening. Stay safe. Bye.